All right, joining me once again here on the Matthew Filipowicz Show is my good buddy Steve Horn. Steve is an investigative journalist whose work has been seen in The Nation, The Guardian, Center for Media and Democracy, Alternet. He is a research fellow at DeSmog Blog, which you can find at desmogblog.com. You can also find him on Twitter at Steve A. Horn. Steve, thank you so much for being on the show again.
Great to be back. Thanks for having me.
All right, so Steve, there was an underreported story a couple of weeks ago about a train that exploded in Virginia, and we've talked about exploding trains an okay amount here on the show before, but tell us about the one that just exploded a couple weeks ago.
Yeah, the latest bomb train explosion is, I didn't actually come up with that term, although some people probably just know me as using that term. It actually came from an industry insider who is a consultant for the industry who came up with the term. And if you go to the Bomb Trains Facebook page, you can read all about that. But anyway, in Lynchburg, Virginia, which is the middle of the state of Virginia, a train owned by CSX Corporation exploded right next to the James River in downtown Lynchburg. Almost miraculously, I would say no one died or was hurt, compared to something that happened this past summer last year in Lake Mégantic, Quebec. That also exploded in a much smaller town, and 47 people died. So this happened downtown in Lynchburg, carrying oil obtained from fracking in the Bakken Shale in North Dakota, and no one died, but 10 of the 13 cars that derailed because of the explosion, or I don't know if it's the other way around, maybe the explosion happened first and then the derailment. There's still investigation being done by the National Transportation Safety Board of the Department of Transportation. But long story short, at least 3 of those cars actually ended up derailing into the river, which means that the oil it was carrying spilled into the river. So upwards of 30,000 barrels of oil spilled into the river because of this explosion and derailment. And the investigation is ongoing in terms of what the extent of the water damage was. I read one article in Capital New York, which is an offshoot of Politico, their New York publication. They said there was a scientist who was quoted in that article that said that because this oil is super thin, which is also why it's super volatile. Bakken oil is more like gasoline, which makes it more explosive. Because it's thin, they said a lot of it, that scientist said a lot of it probably evaporated into the air, which is also bad because it contains volatile organic compounds, which is what makes it explosive again, like benzene, toluene, et cetera. These are carcinogens. But so if that scientist says about half of it may have evaporated, that means still half of that is in the river, depending on how much they have cleaned up. And so it's still an ongoing cleanup effort. But pretty much there's a lot less attention on it than originally, kind of when it first happened, when there was this big image. Now the aftermath of it has to be dealt with. And I know that the Riverkeeper group over there of the Waterkeeper Alliance is still pretty active in testing the water and doing cleanup. But the attention now is more on kind of at the broad level, what's with these cars, why do they explode? And interestingly, this gets into the issue of this DOT 111 model tank car, Department of Transportation 111 versus these newer ones, which is the Catastrophe Prevention Carrier 1232s or CPC 1232s. And those are the ones that are said to be more safe. There's a push to get more of these online. But interestingly, this one in Lynchburg, Virginia was actually 10 of the 13 cars that derailed were these CPC 1232s, so-called catastrophe prevention carriers. But even a catastrophe happened with these cars. So this raises the whole question of, is it even safe to carry this Bakken shale oil on rails? And I think that's something that the federal government has to answer. But I think we got at least one explanation of it by the bomb train exploding in Lynchburg, Virginia. And I think that probably not, or potentially not safe because this happened.
Yeah. Well, like, again, these are supposedly like that. They say, oh, we have we designed these new cars. They're safe. They're the better cars. They're not gonna explode. And here we just see that this is what happened in this accident in Virginia.
Right.
They were a good amount of these cars were these better, supposedly and they probably are better, but it's still like not safe. It's like they're probably better than the old ones, but it doesn't mean that they're actually good and good enough to not derail and explode.
Right, and that's the whole basis of the debate right now, basically in Washington, D.C., is between these DOT 111 older models and these new CPC 1232s that started to be implemented in late 2011. But there's still really no debate overall of are these things even safe at all. And then second of all, I just want to say the approach that they're taking is just essentially more of a transparency approach in labeling, kind of like package labeling of food that's genetically modified or something. Like in this case, they're saying all the tank cars on the train should be labeled so that when inspectors come, if they come randomly, which they started doing after Lake Megantic and something called the Bakken Blitz, basically that's all they're really asking is for it to be labeled. There's really no even talk of the DOT 111 ones being taken offline. There's just really more of a, if you actually read between the lines, they're just talking about adding more CPC 1232s. They're not even talking about taking away these DOT 111. So it's a really, really typical Washington, D.C. debate. And when you really dig into it, you really see there's nothing really substantive that's being done to deal with this issue. It's just kind of smoke and mirrors at the end of the day. And bombs, I guess, bomb trains at the end of the day.
Again, I'm talking to my friend, journalist Steve Horn from DeSmogBlog, DeSmogBlog.com, on Twitter at Steve A. Horn. Let's reiterate, because I remember we talked about this when the last bomb trade exploded. Or maybe it was even the second to last bomb trade exploded. I don't remember which one it was. There's a lot of them.
Yeah.
It's like, but like, just kind of reiterate kind of how many of these trains are there? Where do they go? I mean, because like when we talked about it the last time, it's like it's really unbelievably dangerous, and like they go through towns, they go by schools, they go by where these trains actually travel that are theoretically so volatile and can just like can easily pop and explode. It's actually shocking that more people haven't died yet, but again, we're seeing all these things explode on a fairly regular basis, and there doesn't seem to be any urgency of people going, hold on a second, maybe we should stop these bomb trains from rolling over our countries and near our schools and near our towns.
Yeah, well, so these are, just to give some perspective, in 2008, there were about 8,000 of these tank cars meaning the individual cars on the train. So there's 8,000 of these cars. Now there are, as of 2013 or between 2012 and 2013, there's about 400,000. So it's grown exponentially. Yeah. And that's because during that time, the Bakken Shale developed. There are some pipelines, but over 70% of the oil is taken by train or freight train in the Bakken Shale in North Dakota. And because of that, that's why we're seeing this explosion of these cars going online, and they go everywhere in the United States. They go to the Northwest. They go to California. They go eastward. That's where this one was headed. I think it's an interesting story where this one was headed. I wrote a whole article about it. This CSX train was on its way to Yorktown, Virginia, to a holding facility owned by Plains All American, which is a major corporation that also holds a lot of oil in Cushing, Oklahoma, which is a topic we'll talk about next. But they basically, this train may actually become an export train. That Yorktown facility in Virginia has been pinned down as a possible export location if the domestic crude oil export ban is lifted, and that's been a pretty robust debate this year in Washington, D.C. I don't think it will happen this year or anything because of elections, but it's been talked a lot about, by both the American Petroleum Institute and by politicians who have been bought off by the American Petroleum Institute. So I've been saying since I started learning more about this issue that these trains are really the key to exports of American oil. And imagine if the export ban is lifted, that means even more trains going online, because there's really no indication in North Dakota that many more pipelines are going to be built up. Potentially the Keystone XL northern half, which would carry some 100,000 barrels a day of Bakken oil, and potentially one or two other pipelines, but mostly over basically 1 million barrels a day right now are shipped by train out of the Bakken Shale. So put that in perspective, even if the Keystone XL is built, there's still much more that's going to be carried by train. These trains carry up to, they're usually around 300,000 barrels of oil per train. So 30,000 barrels of oil per tank car, multiply that by 10, 300,000.